Hi, One Lit Teacher here. Today I'd like to provide some brief background on metaphysical poetry. You might be wondering, what does metaphysical mean anyway? Well, that's a great question. Metaphysical means beyond the physical. The Greek root meta means beyond, and physical, of course, refers to nature. Metaphysical is having to do with a branch of philosophy that examines the nature of reality. It is not tangible or concrete. Poets are still writing metaphysical poetry today, but we most frequently associate it with a few very famous writers from the 17th century. So I've included some of those here. I made John Donne's portrait especially large here because I consider John Donne the rock star of metaphysical poetry. And if you enjoy Donne's poetry, you should check out some of my series on John Donne's poetry on my channel, One Lit Teacher. To the right of Donne, we have George Herbert, we have Andrew Marvell, and Henry Vaughan. The qualities of metaphysical poetry are vast, but I will just list some of the more important ones here. Metaphysical poetry is abstract and witty and ironic. It contains subtle arguments and often colloquial language that is, in other words, slang or informal language. Metaphysical poetry uses conceits or extended metaphors built on complex logic. And I'll give you some examples in some of the poetry of Donne and Marvell coming up very soon. Metaphysical poetry focuses on themes like love, religion, and morality, and it seeks to disrupt conventional thinking on those subjects. Metaphysical poetry often employs mixed meter, and if you think about it, that's a way of disrupting convention because in the 17th century, when most of this poetry was written, poets were writing very structured and stylized poetry with very formal, constant meter. The Flea by John Donne is one of the best examples of metaphysical poetry, in my opinion. In this poem, Donne creates an outlandish conceit in which a tiny flea, a microcosm of the relationship of two people, is a representation of the consummation of their marriage ahead of time. So in this scenario, there is a man and he is bitten by a flea and it jumps to his intended lover. And he then builds the argument that since they've already sort of done it inside this flea, that there's really no reason why they shouldn't go ahead and mix their body fluids together. He begins in the first stanza with, "Mark, but this flea, and mark in this, how little that which thou deniest me is. It sucked me first, and now sucks thee. And in this flea our two bloods mingled be. Thou knowest that this cannot be said a sin, nor shame, nor loss of maidenhead. Yet this enjoys before it woo, and pampered swells with one blood made of two. And this, alas, is more than we would do." And so Donne begins this argument setting on its head the conventional idea that premarital sex is a sin. And you can really sense the argumentative diction here. You can see the microcosm of the flea that's used as a very outlandish conceit. He goes on in the second stanza to say, "Oh, stay, 3 lives and 1 flea spare, and beg the woman not to squash the flea." And he extends this idea that it is holy and religious to go ahead and consummate the marriage ahead of time before the actual marriage. And then in the final stanza, he begins with, "Oh, the lady has purpled her nail with the blood of innocence," and sort of humorously concedes that she has squashed his hopes in killing the flea. But before the poem is over, he turns the argument around so that in true John Donne fashion, he cannot lose the argument. So this is a great example of a metaphysical poem. And again, I will do an analysis of this poem in more detail on my YouTube channel in another video called The Flea by John Donne. Another great example of metaphysical poetry is the poem To His Coy Mistress by Andrew Marvell. And this is a very famous poem. In this poem, Marvell creates, again, this very complex logic about this carpe diem theme, seize the day, a very frequent theme in metaphysical poetry and also in cavalier poetry. And he is arguing to this woman outlandishly that if they had all the time in the world, then her coyness would be no crime. And he goes on then to tell her, but we don't have all the time in the world. This is about the first third of the poem here. Had we but world enough and time, this coyness, lady, were no crime. We would sit down and think which way to walk and pass our long love's day. Thou by the Indian Ganges side shouldst rubies find. I by the tide of Umber would complain. I would love you 10 years before the flood, and you should, if you please, refuse till the conversion of the Jews. My vegetable love should grow vaster than empires and more slow, and 100 years should go to praise thine eyes, and on thy forehead gaze, 200 to adore each breast, but 30,000 to the rest, an age at least to every part, and the last age should show your heart. He goes on in the next section to say, but at my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. And so he then extends the argument, or the next layer of the argument, to say, but of course we don't have all the time in the world, so we really need to seize the day. And he concludes with this idea that is a conceit. Let us roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball and tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron gates of life. So these are a little bit crass as far as some of the examples of metaphysical poetry goes, but they're very clever and witty, and they are wonderful examples of a lot of the qualities of metaphysical poetry. So why read metaphysical poetry in the first place? Well, it is highly entertaining and very original, sometimes startlingly so. It's often humorous. So again, even though those examples I just gave are sort of crass, we can tell that the poets were being funny. It is layered in meaning, and so it is intellectually demanding, and it will challenge your intellectual skills. It provides honest insight into human nature and into human thought. If you enjoyed this explanation, then please subscribe to my YouTube channel, One Lit Teacher, for more poetry analysis and explanations about how to approach poetry and other forms of literature.